Scripture lesson this morning is from Matthew 5:21 through 28 and 43 through 45. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, "You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, 'Raka,' is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, and then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully and has already committed adultery with her in his heart." And then 43 through 45. You have heard that it was said, "Love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Deacon. It's good to be back in this place, and I'm so grateful that everyone had fun without me last weekend. I heard that the Mission Sunday was amazing, and I'm so grateful to those who put that together. Bryce led that up with the Missions Committee. We also want to thank the Kitchen Committee, and for those of you who provided food and so many volunteer hours to make that work. I'm so grateful, especially for that. I told Bryce months and months ago, I'm going to be gone this weekend, take it away. And by the time he finished, he and the Missions Committee finished planning that, I said, I don't want to go away now. I want to enjoy that with everyone. So I'm so glad it went well. I'm also thankful to the Reverend Michael Carroll from the Treasure Coast Baptist Association for preaching in my stead and for spending time with you. So it is good to be back. Today, I want to consider, what does it take to move from anger to action? What might it take for you to move from anger to action? This year, many, including us and so many more, will be observing the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, the death camp of Auschwitz from Nazi Germany. 75th year this year of that liberation of that camp. And I wonder what it took for the Nazis and for Germany, both as a nation and as a people, to move from simple anger to action that created and caused the genocide of over 7 million Jews, in addition to 3 million other political prisoners and other minority groups within Germany. How do you move from anger to action? Well, many people have studied this, so there are many theories out there, and we can look at history. History tells us a lot. The first thing you need is propaganda. The media, avenues of education, and various ways of getting people to think differently about another group of people is necessary in moving from anger to action. It's shifting how people perceive and see people of differences within their midst. The Nazis were so intentional with this, Hitler was so intentional, that he even commissioned the churches to preach against the Jews. In fact, he put to work theologians and other clergies and bishops within the Lutheran Church especially to look at Martin Luther's writings and to focus in especially on some of the anti-Semitism that went into some of the reading of the Bible and interpretation of the Bible, and bring that out to the point that even the churches were the tool of the state for propaganda. Education was overturned in order to make sure that pro-Nazi leaders were in both lower and upper education. And it wasn't just a matter of helping people to see people differently. It was a shift of an entire worldview in which others were mere objects, and others were mere objects and targets of derision. It starts with creating skepticism and fear, and moving eventually to legislation as a next step in order to isolate people. You may recall your history lessons of the Jews being rounded up in the ghettos and being isolated so that there's a distinct separation, an easier target, and making people feel less than human. And then, of course, the final step of moving to the place after there's propaganda put in place and a shift of worldview and isolating people through legislation, of turning the state against the people in order to eradicate the enemies in their midst. As we think about this, you can't imagine the travesty and the immense loss of life from men, women, and children in the Holocaust. If you've never watched Schindler's List, it is a good first peek at what it was like to live in those days. And we can only assume that the way that you can get a people to eradicate and eliminate another people group at such a mass scale comes by way of shifting not only one's worldview, but the heart as well. In our lesson today, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is getting ready for a procedure. He is washing his hands and putting on his gloves and his smock, and he is ready to take a scalpel in order to do not just a little heart surgery, but a total heart transplant to those whom he calls disciples. See, he's already talked about the Beatitudes, started out with a word of blessing as he gathered on this mountaintop with his loved ones and his followers. He talked about how they are to be salt in the world and light in the world. He came to mention that he didn't come to abolish the law, but rather to fulfill it. And he even told the disciples in chapter 5, verse 20, that your righteousness should surpass that of even the Pharisees. Can you imagine that? I would say, now Jesus, you had issues with the Pharisees. Now you're telling us that our righteousness should exceed the Pharisees? And I'm certain if he were here in our midst in the flesh, he would say yes, because what he does next in the Sermon on the Mount, as he points out the law and then his interpretation of the law, is he moves past the letter of the law in order to get at the spirit of the law. It is nothing less than seeking righteousness that exceeds the Pharisees, because it's not about the legalities of the law, but rather the heart and the condition of men, and the heart of the matter of what it means to seek righteousness. Chapter 5, verse 21 is Jesus' first interpretation of the law out of 6 laws that he seeks to get at the heart at. We call it the 6 transformational initiatives, or transforming initiatives. There's one here, of course, the first one on murder, and there is an equation for each one. He'll say, you have heard it said, and then the law, but I say to you, and then he gets at the condition of our hearts, and then he gives the transforming initiative in which he gives us a way to move forward. So in this particular lesson, he says, you have heard it said, do not murder, for you will be liable to judgment, but I say to you, do not even be angry. Do not even insult someone. Do not call someone, you fool. And that, what he does is he takes the law and for me it's an affirmation that, not many of us will murder someone. I mean, you may get angry with somebody. So he says, you've heard it said, you shall not murder. That's easy, we're not going to murder anyone. But I say to you, and what he does is he puts our hearts out in the light, and he takes our hearts and he goes for the heart of the subject, and he grabs his scalpel, and he starts to do a total heart transplant by bringing out the very condition of who we are as a people. And the pattern is very clear. He says, you've heard it said, do not murder, but I say to you, do not even be angry. It starts in the mind. Anger is a matter of the mind, what we think in the heart. And then he says, do not insult. And when something takes root in our mind and something takes root in our heart, our worldview or our view of someone else begins to change, and then it comes forth into action, and we say, and then he says, do not say you fool, meaning do not abuse another. It's a word of abuse. It's not like saying, calling somebody a name when somebody cuts you off. It's a matter of abusing someone to the point of robbing them of their humanity, of robbing them of their dignity, and of abusing them to the point of cutting them down to size. It's a matter of heart surgery that Jesus is doing here. Now, some of us get angry and annoyed. That's emotional. We're going through a day, maybe with our spouse, maybe with a loved one, we get angry. It happens all the time. Sometimes we're just annoyed. I'm sure some of you couples out there, you've been through a day where you just say, can you just maybe leave the house for a few hours and maybe come back later? I was talking to my mom. She just got married in June, and I'm always picking on her husband just as a joke. And I said, how's Bob treating you? Is it okay? And she said, oh yeah. I said, are you sure? Are you sure he's treating you good? And I was serious about that. And I said, because when they first got married, they had both apartments, and he ended the lease in his apartment, and of course they got married and moved in. And I said, you sure you don't want to keep the apartment? What happens, don't you want to say, what, Bob, why don't you go home for a weekend and just come back on Monday? So I asked her, I said, is everything good? Yeah, I said, do you wish you had the apartment? You ever tell him, why don't you go take a walk? And he goes, oh, and my mom said, oh no, he's great to live with. And, oh, he's so good, he treats me so well. And he's just so patient with me, and he puts up with, with all my shenanigans. I said, Mom, do you need to take a walk and give him a walk? So we get angry, we get annoyed. We may insult somebody because maybe they cut us off, or we're just being impatient. That's not what Jesus is getting at here. What Jesus is getting at here is a shift in our heart, our worldview, in which our anger festers into resentment. See, you have to remember the Bible says, be angry but sin not. We get angry. This is about deep-seated anger that begins maybe in the head, festers in the heart, and turns into a toxin, into resentment, that motivates us to actually take action against another person or another group of people in which the abuse dehumanizes them. Brings them to a place where they are less than equal. Several weeks ago, the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington featured a professor by the name of Arthur Brooks. He chose to speak at that setting on this sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, in which he actually quoted, it might have been chapter 5, verses 43 and 45, about praying for enemies and loving enemies. And one of the things that he said is that anger and resentment begins with contempt. He quoted a 19th century philosopher by the name of Arthur Schopenhauer, who said this about contempt. Contempt is the unsullied conviction. Now listen to that language. Contempt is the unsullied conviction. It's not a feeling, it's not an emotion, it's not, you're having a bad day. It is a conviction, a value, an unsullied conviction, belief of the worthlessness of another. Contempt is the unsullied conviction of the worthlessness of another. And I think what Jesus is getting at here is, murder is one thing, and you've heard it said, but I say to you, do not even allow contempt or resentment to take root in your life. Especially don't allow it to take root in a way that you actually act upon it. Contempt, this process of moving anger to action, is a direct attack and a denial of the very image of God in another person. See, what's happening is when you get to that place where you are willing to take their life or dehumanize them or abuse them or cut them down to size, it's not that you're attacking them, you're also attacking God's imprint on them, the very image of God, the very dignity and value that God has given each and every individual. This is why I tell people, by the way, I'm pro-life. But I'm pro-life not just for the unborn, I'm pro-life all the way through death. In so many different ways, with a comprehensive program of seeing the sanctity of life, not given to people just because of what they do or don't do, but for the mere fact that each person is created in the image of God, whether they believe it or not. To the point that each person that we may shape our contempt or resentment towards robs them of that very image of God. And that's why Jesus comes back with the next few verses, this in verses 24 through 26, with what we call transformative initiatives, or transforming initiatives. He holds up the law, and then he says, but I say to you. And then he holds the transforming initiative that not only gets at the heart of the subject, but allows us to go through that heart transplant in order for us to move forward in what God's will and righteousness looks like. It's very important to note that he starts with the first initiative, which is a person at worship. Notice this, verse 24, he says, if you're at the altar, you bring your gift to God. Leave your gift there and go and be reconciled to your brother or your sister with whom you have a difference. The reason why Jesus starts at worship is because the resentment or the contempt or the actual shift in how we see other people actually disrupts worship. Worship is at the heart of the matter because we are hypocrites if we bring God a gift of grace out of response out of his grace to us and yet deny the gift of grace for another who needs the gift of our reconciliation or our forgiveness or our act of asking for forgiveness. And so the first transformative initiative is the act that Jesus gets at is the heart of worship, because ultimately our relationship with God and our worship to him is disrupted by the very resentment or contempt or hardship or anger that we may feel towards another. It's hard for us to worship when there are loose ends. It is hard for us to give our gift back to God when we have denied the gift of grace for others. And so Jesus gets at the very heart of the subject, which is this idea that our relationship with God will not be whole unless our relationship with one another is made right. So it's the reason why Jesus was so quick to bless peacemakers in his Beatitudes. And the second thing that Jesus recommends, not just reconciliation out of a posture of grace and as an act of worship in response to God, the second thing he recommends in verse 25 is friendship. He says, if there's somebody who has something against you, go and become friends with them. Go and make friends. Become friends. This past weekend, we had a family visit us for the weekend, good friends of ours from Atlanta, and they have two little girls, 7-year-old and 9-year-old. And I thought, well, little girls, that's exciting, but I was worried that they were going to be bored because my son is 12 and Haley is 15. I thought, well, I hope they don't feel left out because what is, Hayden's 12 and he's a boy. What is he going to have in common with the girls, and will the girls be bored or whatever? And so I was a little concerned. I want to make sure my guests are taken care of, and I want to make sure Hayden's taking time to interact with the girls and Haley's there and present, rather than going to her room. And so the girls came, and I was worried about it a little bit, but before you know, within minutes, everyone was playing Nerf guns, shooting each other. And everyone was playing Legos, and Hayden just jumped right in, and they were playing Legos, and they were playing with Nerf guns. I didn't have to worry a bit. They were quick friends. We knew each other for years, but I thought maybe the age, girls and boys, would be different. But Hayden just jumped right in, and it was as if they didn't skip a beat, as if they were best friends. And I thought, the power of friendship. No wonder when Jesus is talking about being a servant to his disciples, he doesn't say, when you're a disciple, you should be like James, John, and Peter. When you need to grow up. What does Jesus say about discipleship? If you want to enter the kingdom of God, become like children. And I think friendship is something that children model for us. It doesn't matter, my son didn't have to interview the girls. What religion, persuasion are you? What political persuasion are you? Do you vote the same way I do? He didn't give a quiz. They just jumped in. And before you know it, they were shooting each other with Nerf guns and making a mess of the house because they were having fun with laughter. And I think children for us model for what I think friendship. That the very friendship that Jesus is getting at here. It is hard to hold a grudge against someone. It's hard to see someone as other or as an enemy or as different or someone who is an object of contempt when you know them, when you are friends with those people. I think this is why Jesus says later on, when your enemy, when a centurion, an enemy, asks you to walk 1 mile, go 2 miles. You know, we think about that. You have to remember when Jesus is talking about the centurions, these are the enemies of the people of Israel. They represent the oppression of Israel, the violence of Rome. These centurions are not friends. They represent the power of the Roman state, and they can execute you anytime. They can arrest you anytime. These are standing armies. But Jesus has the nerve to say, if they ask you to go 1 mile, go 2. Why is that? And my feeling is because when you go 2 miles, it's hard for you not to find something in common. As a disciple, if you're going 2 miles, you have a time to talk to your enemy and to put a face to and a name to your face. And I think that Jesus encouraged them to go 2 miles in order to become friends with the person so that they see that the people whom they are oppressing are people too. And you have a chance to bear witness and to become friends. And so what we find here is a movement not only to reconciliation, but to friendship. It is hard to discriminate against another person or people group if you have close friends with those people. So Jesus gives us 2 transforming initiatives. To notice that worship, we interrupt and disrupt worship by the resentment that might hold bitterness or take root in our heart. And that friendship is that act of reversing or perpetuating the anger or the hurts that we may have for one another. That creates discord and division within our midst. And you'll notice that the undercurrent is the opposite. You have to catch this because you'll miss it if you don't. Notice the undercurrent. He says, if you're angry, you're liable to judgment. If you insult someone, you're liable to be thrown into jail, or you're liable to go to the courts. And if you call someone a fool, you're liable to the fires of hell. And then he automatically uses a legal kind of argument if your accuser takes you to court. All of these principles lead to one thing, and that is imprisonment. And I think what Jesus is pointing out to as he gets to the heart of the matter is any heart that is held captive by resentment and contempt and anger is imprisoned within and tormented within its own state of hate. And I think that's why Jesus uses judgment and liability and the court system to point out the heart of the matter. Because when we are angry at someone, when resentment takes hold, when we see someone with contempt, it only imprisons us. We're only tormenting ourselves. I would imagine if I were to interview many of you, you can probably tell me a story where someone kept you up at night because you were so frustrated with them, maybe angry, maybe annoyed. Maybe somebody got nitpicky and they were just picking on you, and you're up at night thinking and shredding and torment. You're in a state of torment and duress, and you're upset with the person. Meanwhile, the other person is at home just having a blast. They're not even thinking about you. And we imprison ourselves and torment ourselves within this place of anger rather than finding release. And not only release for ourselves, but also releasing others of the contempt that we hold for them. You know, sometimes I've been annoyed or frustrated with somebody and they've kept me up at night, and usually I get to the place where I say this, I don't want to feel this way anymore. And it drives me to take a different approach. It drives me to prayer so that I may not be held captive by my own anger or resentment. And I think Jesus uses judgment and the courts in order to press this. One of the things we have to learn here is, by the way, this also goes for the next transforming initiative about lust. Jesus says, you've heard it said, do not commit adultery. I say to you, don't even lust after someone. Because what happens is you're moving from a place of, if you're lusting after a person to the point of desiring them, you're moving from a place of companionship, of seeing them as a fellow human being, to being an object that you want to consume. So that's how the dehumanization works. And then, of course, Jesus goes into the transforming initiative of taking care of people who have no power, which is back then women. So don't go and divorce a woman just because you want to be married to somebody else. So what we find here is that Jesus is rewriting these transforming initiatives. These are not recommendations. These are not suggestions. Rather, what Jesus is doing is he is rewriting norms of how we live in community with each other. One theologian calls it Christoformation. Not transformation, but Christoformation, meaning the transformative ways that Christ compels us to live by new norms. That has a conviction that others have the stamp of God's image, and that the sanctity of life defies even the actions that others may do, not only in their own life, but towards us. A conviction about the sanctity of life that affirms others, even when they may be the enemy, or may have hurt you. And the call that Jesus has for us is reversing the norms of our own attitude, of doing heart surgery in us, of having a total heart transplant in our life so that we can move away and acknowledge the hurts, because many of us are angry because we're just plain hurt, of acknowledging the hurts, of leaving the things that, some things behind in order to settle the differences and the hurts that exist among us, in order to bring about a kind of righteousness that exceeds that of the Pharisees. There is a story that Peter Marty, the editor of the Christian Century, tells a story about a lady named Mary, who was born in 1923 and was a part of a wave, you may not know this about our history. Between 1854 and 1929, some large cities like New York and Philadelphia had a program in which they took orphans, put them on trains, and shipped them out west in order to place them in families. There were no laws to protect the children. There were no equal opportunity laws. All they did, some of these cities had certain laws that basically shipped these children, orphans, in order to place the families out west without really going through a procedure. Some describe the process of it being like a kind of an auction atmosphere where once those trains got out west, they would auction off the children. Many families in the West, by the way, were looking for cheap labor on their farms. And so they didn't know, they would take these orphans in. And as many as 200,000 orphans were shipped west through these programs, one of which was a lady by the name of Mary. She said that when she got out west and she met her family, her mother would beat her every day. When she would go to school, she'd look in her lunchbox, and instead of a sandwich, her father would put a rock in her lunchbox. Peter Marty, reflecting on this with his friend Mary, said, "How did you end up raising such an amazing family? I mean, how did you get out of that upbringing and your children are successful and they're amazing?" And she said one thing. She said, "God's grace." She quoted Ephesians 2:8, "By God's grace I have been saved by faith, not by my own works, but by God's grace." You see, she was able to forgive her parents, forgive her very country that put her in that position. And she was able to forgive to a place where she acknowledges God's grace, and she was able to give that gift to her parents, her foster parents, in order to live a free life, to create the family, the kind of family that honored God. Now, I don't know where you are today. Some of you may be doing great, that's great, but some of you may be under the weight or under the burden of a kind of resentment or contempt, or perhaps, you know what, let's leave contentment and resentment out, because those are words, some of you say, "Oh, I'm not resentful." Let's use another word. Some of you may be under a burden of hurt, where you have been so hurt in the past, or you have hurt someone so badly, that today Jesus is coming to you with a scalpel ready to do a heart transplant. Not to bring you to a place where you can say kumbaya with those who hurt you, but rather to move you to a place, not to move from anger to action, but rather to be as vigilant of moving and intentional as moving towards healing as Hitler was in moving towards hate. So where are the hurts today? Only you can answer that. Where do you need a heart transplant today? Remember, this is not a recommendation. This is Jesus rewriting the norms of how we are to go about the righteousness of God within our own life. May we continue to hear God's voice and respond in a way in which grace continues to expand in our midst, just as God has been so graceful to us and has forgiven us. Amen. Let us pray.